Hey everyone, and welcome back to Be Like Christ. We are talking about Deuteronomy chapter 3 today in our 5-minute studies. As always, you can download these free handouts on our website at tobelikechrist.com. Let's talk about Deuteronomy chapter 3. And I should mention before we get into this and into the future chapters, the when, the characters, and the where section on these outlines are not going to change a whole lot throughout the book of Deuteronomy. So as we become more familiar with this information, I think I'll probably spend less time in this section and summarize more quickly. But for now, let's go through this information. So when did the events of Deuteronomy chapter 3 take place? These events occurred at the end of the Israelites' 40 years of wandering in the wilderness. They were in the wilderness from approximately 1490 BC to 1450 BC. So the book of Deuteronomy opens, it tells us specifically on the first day of the 11th month of the 40th year since the Israelites left Egypt. So that'd be about 1450 BC. In terms of our characters for this chapter, we've got the Israelites, also known as the Hebrews. They are God's special selected people who he is going to show his glory through. They are a large nation of people who are the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. They were enslaved in Egypt for about 40 years, they were enslaved in Egypt for several hundred years. And now they have left Egypt. God gave them freedom. He gave them his law in the wilderness, and now he's leading them to the land of Canaan. We also have Moses. He is the leader of the Israelites, and God speaks to Moses, and Moses delivers God's words to the people so that they can obey and understand who God is and what he wants from them. We also talked about Sihon in the last chapter. He's the king of the Amorites. We're going to talk about Og in this chapter. He's the king of Bashan. And then moving down to our map, Deuteronomy chapter 1 verse 5 tells us that Moses spoke the words of the book of Deuteronomy while in Moab, probably near the plains of Moab, which was near Mount Pisgah. You can see Mount Pisgah just to the right of the Dead Sea or the Salt Sea at the top right corner of the map. And this chapter specifically describes how Moses divided up the land of Bashan, Gilead, and the land of the Amorites, and he distributed between the tribes of Reuben, Gad, and half of the tribe of Manasseh. Okay, as we move over to the next page and we talk about our outline section, the first section here, verses 1 through 13, the Israelites are going to defeat Og, the king of Bashan. So we talked about them defeating Sihon last chapter. Now they're going to defeat Og. So Og was the king of Bashan, and he prepared his army to go out and to fight with this approaching Israelite large amount of people. He did not want them in his land. So God told Moses that he was not to fear Og because God intended to give Og and his land over into the hands of the Israelites. And at the battle, that's exactly what happened. The Israelites defeated all of Og's men and took possession of all of his cities. We're told that there were 60 cities, and these cities and their inhabitants were destroyed. One interesting thing that we're told in the early parts of the Old Testament is that there were men of incredible height who lived back in these times, and they're often referred to as giants. Og was one of these men of incredible height. The text tells us that Og was a descendant of the Rephaim. The Rephaim were men who were renowned for their stature, according to verse 20 and 21. And we are specifically given the dimensions of Og's bed, which gives us some idea of how tall he might have been. It was roughly 13 and a half feet long and 6 feet wide. So that'd be 4.1 meters by 1.8 meters. In the second section of chapter 3, we're going to talk about the inheritance of Reuben, Gad, and half of the tribe of Manasseh. So this actually, to understand the story, we have to look back actually at the book of Numbers chapter 32. That gives us some background on what's going on here. So the land that the Israelites had conquered east of the Jordan River was divided up between the tribes of Reuben, Gad, and the half-tribe of Manasseh. These tribes had specifically requested to live on the east side of the Jordan River because they had a lot of livestock, and that land was very good for their livestock. That's according to Numbers chapter 32, verses 1 through 5. However, when they went to Moses and asked if they could have this land, they made a promise to him and to the rest of the Israelites that their fighting men would also travel to the west side of Jordan and help the other tribes conquer their land, right? So they didn't get to cop out on all of the fighting. And Moses required them to keep this vow now that they had received their inheritance. And they agreed to do it, and they did do it. Our final section in this chapter, verses 21 through 29, kind of a sad section. Moses is prohibited from entering the land of Canaan. So Moses encouraged Joshua to remember Israel's defeat of Sihon and Og, and to allow that memory to give him confidence that God was going to aid him in the upcoming battles to conquer the rest of the land of Canaan. Moses knew, well, you remember Joshua was Moses' assistant who was going to take over leadership of the Israelites for Moses when Moses died. I probably should have put him in the character section, but I didn't. Okay, so Moses knew that he was not going to be able to enter the land of Canaan. God had forbidden him from entering Canaan, according to Numbers chapter 20, verse 24, but he pled with God to change his mind. However, God was resolute, and he would not change his mind. He would not let Moses go into the land because of disobedience that Moses had a sin of Moses's in the past. He told Moses that he would be allowed to ascend the nearby mountain, Mount Pisgah, and he could look over the land that his people were going to inherit. And so that is where Deuteronomy chapter 3 ends. And that leads us directly into our application section. Godly people may have to endure consequences from previous sins. Moses was a godly man, and I don't think that there's any doubt that he was faithful to God following the misstep that had prohibited him from entering the land of Canaan. And so there's a couple applications that we can take from that. Number one, there will be times when we have to face the consequences of our bad decisions, even though we've repented and we've turned back to God. A second application, this truth and understanding this should give us pause when judging other people. A person struggling through the consequences of sin may no longer be a sinner. They may be a godly person working through the consequences of poor decisions in a past life when they weren't followers of God. So when you see somebody struggling with those things, working through those things that maybe sin brought about, just know that that doesn't necessarily mean that they're participating in those sins any longer. They may be on God's side now, so be careful before you judge.